At the end of August this year, Canada suddenly announced that it would impose tariffs of up to 100% on electric vehicles exported from China and a 25% tariff on steel and aluminum products. However, interestingly, China has not yet launched a second round of countermeasures against these measures of Canada, but India has begun to get involved. In September this year, India decided to impose tariffs of 12% to 30% on welded stainless steel pipes exported from China to India due to concerns about dumping. However, some industry authorities pointed out that although India's move has a good starting point, the reality is somewhat unsatisfactory because the current production capacity of local steel companies in India cannot meet the huge domestic infrastructure construction needs. Therefore, sanctioning Chinese steel is undoubtedly a dead end. So why does India follow Western countries in imposing sanctions on China? Will China take countermeasures against India as in the past? If you like our video content, please click to subscribe to my YouTube channel so that you can receive all our latest video content. Now let's get into today's topic. Canada has always been the closest ally of the United States and almost obeys the instructions of the United States. Some time ago, after Sullivan visited Canada and left, the Canadian government immediately launched a series of actions, including imposing tariffs on Chinese electric vehicle exports and steel and aluminum products. As for why such high tariffs were introduced, Canada explained in a statement that this was for trade protection and intended to protect the development of its auto industry. Not only that, the Canadian government also further stated that it might impose tariffs on Chinese exports of batteries and minerals in the future. However, as soon as Canada's tariff policy was announced, the Chinese government quickly took reciprocal measures to counter Canada's tariff increase. As far as I know, less than 3 days after Canada announced sanctions, China took a total of 4 countermeasures. Among them, the most noteworthy one is the anti-dumping investigation on canola imported from Canada, because it has a direct and significant impact on Canada's economy. In addition to canola, China has also launched a similar investigation on Canada's petrochemical products. It is worth mentioning that if China really restricts the import of these products, Canada's petrochemical industry will face tremendous pressure, and it will be difficult to find alternative markets in the short term. In addition, China has also reported these violations of Canada to the World Trade Organization, accusing Canada of breach of contract through an international platform and trying to put more pressure on Canada with the help of global public opinion. What is more concerning is that China announced an anti-discrimination investigation against Canada, which is the first such investigation in the world and is particularly eye-catching. But surprisingly, in the face of China's countermeasures, Canada did not take further new sanctions, but India joined the camp of sanctions against China. On September 10th of this year, the Indian Ministry of Finance officially announced that it would impose tariffs of 12% to 30% on some steel products imported from China on the grounds of so-called protection and promotion of local industries. Obviously, India, like Canada, is actually carrying out unreasonable economic suppression on China under the banner of trade protectionism. Some Chinese media pointed out that India may be following Canada's footsteps and chose to take similar actions against China after China sanctioned Canada. So, is this really the case? There seems to be no direct connection between India and Canada. In fact, India's sanctions on China are not to emulate Canada, but the United States. According to my investigation, before India announced sanctions against China, the U.S. Treasury Department sanctioned 2 Indian shipping companies on the grounds of helping Russia expand its energy capabilities. In addition, the U.S. Pentagon recently launched a military maintenance center project, inviting Japan, South Korea, Australia, Singapore, and the Philippines to participate. But India, which has been helping the U.S. Navy with logistical maintenance, was excluded from the list. This move has caused a lot of speculation. Some analysts believe that India has ignored repeated warnings from the West and continued to maintain close economic and trade exchanges with Russia, causing them to lose the trust of the United States and be kicked out of the circle of friends. So now India's sudden action against China is likely to be to show loyalty to the United States, trying to regain the trust and support of the United States and to gain more advantages in global competition by limiting China's market share. But coincidentally, the time when India imposed tariffs was just after Canada announced the expansion of the scope of tariffs on Chinese goods, which also makes people wonder whether India wants to please the West by imposing sanctions on China. It is worth noting that after India announced the imposition of high tariffs on China, some authoritative sources said that although India's starting point may be to protect its own interests, this approach is actually very short-sighted. Because on the surface, India is sanctioning China, but in the end it may hurt itself. So why do you say that? In fact, the main reason is that China has always been India's largest steel supplier. India is the world's second largest steel producer, but as a developing country, its demand for steel is still very large, and domestic production cannot meet the demand at all. With the continuous development of India's economy and the increasing investment of the government in infrastructure projects, the demand for steel has shown a trend of sustained growth. Especially after Modi came to power in 2014, India vigorously promoted infrastructure construction and real estate development, which led to a surge in demand for steel. In 2015, India's annual steel consumption exceeded 90 million tons, and by the end of 2023, this figure had exceeded 140 million tons. It can be said that India is one of the countries with the fastest growth in steel consumption among the world's major economies. However, as of 2023, India's steel production is only 120 million tons, which still cannot meet domestic demand. In contrast, China is the world's largest steel producer, producing more than 1 billion tons per year and exporting about 90 million tons. Steel is a key material for national construction. Although many countries can produce steel, they do not necessarily have the ability to export it, and some countries even need to import it. Therefore, most countries choose to import steel from China, and India is no exception. According to my survey, India's steel imports from China surged by 91% last year, accounting for 1/3 of its total imports. In the first half of this year, China's steel exports to India soared to 5 million tons. For India, China's steel exports have undoubtedly caused a huge impact on the local steel industry, but this also reflects from the side that India is currently highly dependent on the Chinese steel market. Especially at present, India is in the midst of a construction boom, actively promoting the modernization of road, rail networks, and ports. It is expected that by 2030, India's annual steel consumption will increase to more than 200 million tons. Even not long ago, India set a goal to triple its domestic steel production to 500 million tons per year by 2047. If China reduces its steel exports to India or raises its export prices due to the imposition of tariffs, it will undoubtedly be a serious blow to India. Even if the price of China's steel products rises, it is still more competitive than other countries. Therefore, the heavy tax of 30% will eventually be passed on to India's infrastructure companies and consumers, bringing them greater economic pressure. Therefore, from the above information, it can be seen that this is why some experts believe that India has sanctioned China, but it is the biggest victim. Of course, some people also believe that part of the reason for India's tariff increase is to promote the development of related industries in the country. The Indian government has always wanted to become a manufacturing power, but to achieve this goal, it must make breakthroughs in related fields. However, China's high-quality and low-cost exports have made the Indian government feel that the development of its manufacturing industry faces huge challenges. In this case, imposing additional tariffs can alleviate the competitive pressure faced by local industries to a certain extent. The Indian government may realize that it is highly dependent on Chinese steel, so it is reasonable to want to promote the development of its own steel and manufacturing industries. However, I believe that promoting the development of its own manufacturing industry by imposing additional tariffs to harm China's interests will inevitably cause strong dissatisfaction from the Chinese government. What is even more infuriating is that the Indian government is imposing additional tariffs on Chinese exports while confronting Western countries. This is undoubtedly a gesture of goodwill to Western countries, such as the United States, which have irreconcilable contradictions with China. Such behavior is obviously impossible to be tolerated by China. Although China is currently facing trade sanctions and tariff pressures from the United States and other Western countries, and even has to deal with military deterrence from as many as 32 NATO countries in the Asia-Pacific region, China has launched anti-dumping investigations on almost all EU member states allied with the United States and Canada and other countries on their export goods. Not only that, China has also transferred some export orders from EU member states that are subject to anti-dumping investigations to other countries. China can also fight back against India's practice of imposing additional tariffs on China through anti-dumping investigations and transferring orders to other countries. Although China has not yet launched a counter-investigation against India, the Indian government cannot afford such a situation. So, what do you think of the situation? To not miss out on our future projects and news updates, please make sure you subscribe to our channel and turn on notifications. We will continue to provide you with more exciting and interesting content.